I stood at the edge of the stage, the velvet curtain brushing my fingertips, and for a moment, I let the silence of the empty theater settle around me. The polished wood beneath my heels gleamed in the faint spotlight, reflecting the woman I had become, confident, composed, untouchable, but still, deep inside, traces of that girl who had been shoved aside lingered. My phone buzzed sharply in my clutch, jolting me out of the reverie. I glanced at the screen. A name I hadn't expected, not in 1,000 lifetimes. Megan, the one who had stepped into my role, into my dreams, while I watched from the shadows. I hesitated, thumb hovering over the notification, heart fluttering with a cocktail of irritation, curiosity, and something I couldn't name, satisfaction. I smoothed my silk blouse, feeling the cool fabric against my skin, and let my eyes drift toward the city lights outside the theater's window. The skyline glimmered like a promise I had once thought was stolen. The faint scent of my coffee, still warm from the cup I hadn't finished, mixed with the lingering perfume from my dressing room. I smiled to myself, ironic and unshakable. They had taken my place once. But not anymore. Not today. I had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in my mind, in my dreams, even in my quiet, lonely victories when no one was watching. Every note I would sing tonight, every word I would command, every glance from the audience, it would belong to me. And somewhere deep beneath the adrenaline and the polished calm, I felt the familiar thrill. The stage had always been mine. It was just a matter of reclaiming it. I remember the sting of that day like it was yesterday, even though it had been years. I was 22, full of fire and hope, ready to step into the spotlight I had been promised. My first major solo performance at the Lincoln Theater, my moment. I had rehearsed every note, every movement, every breath, believing in myself with a conviction that could have moved mountains. But then, Megan arrived. Smooth, confident, with that effortless charm that seemed to make doors swing open for her. And just like that, she was handed the role I had worked for, the one I had earned, or so I thought. My heart had pounded against my ribs as I watched her walk onto the stage that should have been mine. I could feel the lump forming in my throat, my hands trembling, and for the first time in my life, I tasted the bitter sting of being invisible in the face of someone else's advantage. I remember retreating backstage, tears burning behind my eyes, trying not to show the humiliation. My grandmother's voice echoed in my memory, calm, unwavering, a small hand resting on mine. "Elizabeth," she had said, her eyes fierce and soft at once, "they can take the stage, but they can't take your fire. Promise me you'll hold on to it." She pressed a small, silver locket into my palm, something I had worn since childhood. It was simple, unassuming, but to me, it was a reminder that my worth wasn't determined by someone else's choices. That night, I left the theater without a word, holding that locket against my chest. The city felt colder, lonelier, but somewhere inside, a quiet determination began to grow. I told myself, with every shaky step I took away from the applause I should have had, that this was not the end. It was a challenge, a proving ground. I would build my own stage, carve my own space, and one day, they would see the woman I had become. Every rejection, every side glance, every whispered doubt from the people who had once been my support became fuel. I learned to rely on myself, to trust the fire my grandmother had reminded me of. That locket, warm against my palm, became my talisman, a quiet promise. The world could take my place, but they could never claim my voice, my drive, or the stage I was destined to own. Leaving the theater that night wasn't just a retreat, it was the beginning of a reinvention. I moved into a small apartment in Brooklyn, the kind with creaking floors and chipped paint, and started building my life from scratch. I took jobs that felt unrelated at first, teaching voice lessons, small gigs at local cafes, anything that kept me connected to music, but I never stopped dreaming of my stage. It was during one of those early gigs that I met Claire, a seasoned performer who had seen it all. She noticed me struggling with a piece I had written, raw and unpolished, but overflowing with emotion. "Elizabeth," she said, voice sharp but encouraging, "you have something they can't teach. Don't let anyone decide your worth." Work, focus, and own it. She became my mentor, showing me the nuances of the industry, the contracts, the auditions, the politics. Nights were long and often lonely. I'd find myself in front of the mirror at 2 in the morning, voice hoarse, hands trembling from exhaustion, questioning if I had the courage to keep going. But every small success became a brick in the foundation of my independence. My first paid solo performance, a modest $150, felt like winning the lottery. My first client, someone willing to pay for private lessons, made me feel seen again. I started investing in my craft, taking classes, recording demos in tiny rented studios, and even quietly networking with producers and venue owners. Slowly, the woman who had once been pushed aside was creating a life that couldn't be ignored. I was careful, though. My family, especially my mother, had never been supportive, and I didn't want their skepticism to seep into my victories. So I kept much of my progress private, posting only casual updates on social media, pictures of sunsets, snippets of city life, carefully avoiding the details of my career. It felt strange at first, like hiding a secret part of myself, but it became a shield. The less they knew, the more power I quietly amassed. By the time I hit 28, I had a small but devoted following, a few successful gigs, and enough savings to invest in my first professional studio. I had built a sanctuary where my voice was heard on my terms, where my stage was mine alone. And every night, as I polished the floors or tuned the instruments, I would touch the silver locket my grandmother had given me, remembering her words. Every struggle, every quiet victory, every sleepless night had brought me closer to reclaiming what had been stolen. And while Megan and the others lived unaware of the life I had built, I carried my own quiet satisfaction. The fire inside me, nurtured through years of doubt and rejection, had grown into something unstoppable. The stage I had once been denied was no longer a dream. It was my reality, waiting for the moment I would finally let the world see it. The knock at my studio door was unexpected, precise, and deliberate. I knew immediately who it was. Megan, and with her, a few others who had once smirked at my ambitions or assumed I would fade into obscurity. I took a deep breath, adjusting the silk blouse I had chosen for tonight, the one I wore when I needed to feel untouchable. My reflection in the mirrored wall showed a woman calm, collected, and ready. The Elizabeth of 22 would have crumbled at this moment. The Elizabeth of 28 smiled quietly, knowing the power of her presence. Elizabeth. Megan's voice, casual but strained, drifted through the open door. She stepped inside with a self-assured air, expecting perhaps a small studio, a struggling musician. She didn't know what she was walking into. I motioned for her to enter. "Welcome," I said softly, letting the words hang in the air. Her eyes scanned the studio, and I let them. Expensive instruments lined the walls, gleaming under the soft lighting. Framed accolades, photos of performances, and contracts neatly stacked on the shelves hinted at a life of success she could never have anticipated. A plush, modern chair sat at my workspace, surrounded by the latest recording equipment. Every detail spoke of someone who had worked tirelessly, relentlessly, and without apology. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. I didn't realize. I smiled, letting the pause stretch, enjoying the tension. "You took my place once," I began, voice steady, commanding. "You walked onto stages I had earned, and you watched me retreat. But tonight you're seeing the real stage, the one I built, the one I own." Megan's eyes flickered between disbelief and shame, and I allowed myself a moment of quiet satisfaction. She hadn't expected this. No one had. I walked slowly to the center of the room, letting the subtle click of my heels echo, a rhythm that mirrored my heartbeat. "I've invested every sleepless night, every moment of doubt into this," I continued. "Every lesson, every gig, every quiet victory you never noticed, it was all for this moment. My stage, my rules, my life." Her face drained of color. Another of the visitors, a former colleague, whispered, "I thought she was struggling." I turned to him, voice soft but sharp, slicing through the tension. "Struggling? That's a word for people who gave up. I didn't." And now, I own what was always meant to be mine. I walked to my locket on the desk, lifting it between my fingers. This, I said, holding it up, was given to me when I was told I wasn't enough. It's a reminder that my voice, my fire, can't be taken, even when others try. Silence filled the studio. I let them absorb it, every detail, every layer of my journey laid bare. And then I added, almost casually, so, welcome to my world. The stage you once occupied is no longer yours. But the opportunity to respect, learn, and grow? That's up to you. Megan's lips trembled. The former colleague's jaw clenched. And in that room, the shift was complete. The woman they had underestimated had arrived, fully, undeniably, and with the power to change how the past was remembered. I let them stand there a moment longer, taking it all in, before I stepped back to the desk, signaling subtly that the room and the stage were now mine entirely. I leaned against my desk, arms crossed, studying each of them carefully. The air was thick with disbelief, guilt, and that awkward tension that comes when the world suddenly flips upside down for those who once felt superior. I could see it in Megan's eyes, the flicker of regret, the hesitation to meet mine. I could feel it in the way the former colleague shifted uneasily, like a child caught in the wrong classroom. And I realized in this moment that I held the power. But power, I reminded myself, was not cruelty. It was clarity. It was choice. And I was going to give them conditions, clear, firm, and fair for any future interaction with me or my stage. Megan, I began, my voice calm but commanding, you took what wasn't yours once. You need to acknowledge that fully before moving forward. You can't continue to take opportunities by assuming they belong to you. Respect comes first. Learn it, practice it, embody it. Only then can you even think about sharing a space with me again. She nodded, eyes wet, lips pressed together. I understand, she whispered, and I let her absorb that truth. Turning to the former colleague, I continued, and you assumed I would fail quietly. You need to step out of the judgment, stop undermining talent, and pursue your own growth instead of comparing yourself to others. Own your skills, but don't let arrogance blind you. I paused, letting the weight of my words settle in the room. These aren't punishments, I added. They're opportunities. You can grow, or you can step aside. That choice is yours. Then I addressed the others, who had come expecting nothing more than a superficial reunion. Everyone here has a part to play in their own journey. Toxic habits, self-doubt, arrogance, they all limit what you can become. Change them. Take responsibility for your actions. If you can't, you won't have a place here. I could see some stiffen, some falter, but most were listening, truly listening for the first time. The power balance had shifted, yes, but it wasn't about revenge. It was about establishing respect, boundaries, and a path forward that demanded honesty and growth. And as I stood there, eyes sweeping the room, I felt a profound sense of alignment. I was no longer the girl who had been sidelined, invisible, dismissed. I was Elizabeth, leader, artist, owner of my craft, my stage, my story. I had the authority to shape not just my environment, but the behavior of those who sought to enter it. Finally, I allowed a small smile, warm but unmistakably firm. You have choices, I said. Respect the rules, earn your place, and maybe, just maybe, you'll see the power of someone who refused to be replaced. Silence followed, heavy but transformative. For the first time, I could feel the subtle shift in energy, the room recognizing the new reality. And I knew with certainty that this stage, this life, this power, I had claimed it fully. The days that followed were quiet, but the change was undeniable. Megan started showing up differently, not just in her demeanor, but in her work ethic. She practiced, she listened, and she admitted her mistakes without excuses. The former colleague began taking responsibility for his actions, pursuing his own projects with focus rather than comparison. Others, too, started to shed habits that had limited them for years. Change wasn't instant, but it was real, and it was the kind of growth I had wanted for them all along. I watched them, a subtle smile tugging at my lips, feeling a deep, steady satisfaction. My stage was no longer just a place for performance. It was a sanctuary of respect, ambition, and accountability. And I realized that the journey had been as much about shaping my own world as it had been about reclaiming what had been taken from me. Late at night, when the studio was silent and the city lights flickered outside, I would touch the silver locket my grandmother had given me. It still felt warm, as if the promise of her words, "They can't take your fire," had somehow traveled through time and space to reach this exact moment. That small, unassuming token reminded me of everything I had endured, every tear, every sleepless night, every doubt I had conquered. It was a symbol of resilience, of the power to rise above, and of the stage I had always deserved. I reflected on the journey, the girl who had been pushed aside, the woman who had persevered in silence, and the woman I had become, strong, unyielding, and unapologetically herself. Relationships had been tested, hearts had been hardened and softened, and yet, here I stood, in control not only of my career but of my destiny. As I looked around my studio, filled with instruments, awards, and memories of every small victory, I felt a profound sense of closure. The past no longer had the power to hurt me. The people who had once underestimated me were no longer threats. They were reflections of the choices they had yet to make, and I had given them that opportunity with clarity and compassion. I took a deep breath, feeling the pulse of the city, the rhythm of my own heartbeat, and the lingering warmth of my grandmother's wisdom. And as I stepped onto my stage once more, the lights illuminating every corner, I knew that nothing could ever take this from me again. "They took my place," I whispered to myself, voice steady and full of pride, "but now I own the stage."